Bessie Coleman, when she was a kid, she had to walk miles to go to an all-black school. When she was 9 years old, her dad left her. Her dad had her drop out of school to pick cotton for her family. Bessie Coleman moved to Chicago with her two brothers. Bessie Coleman earned her pilot's license for flying. Bessie Coleman was the first African American woman to do an air stunt show in the air. Then after that, Bessie Coleman was invited to special events after she had did an air stunt in the air. So Bessie Coleman was the one that made up the first African American flight school. She influenced Mae Jemison to be the first African American woman to go into space. Bessie Coleman was the first person that influenced Mae Jemison to go up in space because she was that one that wanted to go into space. So Bessie Coleman was the first one to do an air stunt show in the air after she died.
Did you know Bessie Coleman was the first African American woman to fly? In this speech, I will be teaching you all about Bessie Coleman and how she impacted history. Bessie Coleman was born in Atlanta, Texas, 1892. Bessie had to walk miles to her school. Her father left her and her family when she was 9 years old. Bessie had to drop out of school because she and her family had to pick cotton. Then she wanted to go to college, so she got a job. Then she went to college, but then she ran out of money, so she had to return home. Then her brothers went to war, and when she read in the newspaper about the fighting in Europe, and she was worried. Then one brother, when she returned, he said, "The French women are braver than you." But then Bessie did not give up her dream about flying. Then she went on a ship to France, and she found a flying lessons place. And after a few years, and she passed. Then she returned to America, and she was interviewed by reporters. She always wanted to open a flying school for African Americans, but she would need money to start the school. But before she could do a flying show, she returned to France to learn more about flying and stunts. Then Bessie came back and went to New York on September 3rd, 1922, and she was giving an air show, and she became a barnstormer. One of her stunts was a loopy-loop. Also, she went straight up and went upside down and parachuted out of her plane. But at first, she had to borrow a plane for the shows. But then she got enough money to buy her own plane, but her plane had a broken engine and jammed it, and it crashed, and she had a broken leg and broken ribs and a lot of cuts. After 3 months, Bessie went back to flying. In April 1926, Bessie agreed to do an air show in Jacksonville, Florida. Also, she had to parachute. Then her and her mechanic took the plane to see out of the plane to look for a spot for her parachute jump. Bessie didn't have her seatbelt on because she needed to see out of the plane. Then the plane went into a spin, and Bessie fell out and died. So did William Willis then when the plane crashed. So before she died, her dream was to open a flight school for African Americans. After a few years, they opened a flight school. Also, the post office had a stamp for her, and in Chicago, they even have their own day for her. Also, in Chicago, they named a street after her.
Did you know that Bessie Coleman was the first African American woman to fly a plane? I'm going to be teaching you about Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman was born in Atlanta, Texas in 1892. Bessie Coleman had to walk a mile to an all-black school. Bessie Coleman's father left her when she was 9 years old. She went to France to become a pilot. She was inspired by these African American war pilots that worked for France. And then she had to be trained to fly. She learned, and then one day she's about to parachute land with her mechanic. And they take their seat belts off at the time when Bessie Coleman reached her head out her plane and did a barrel roll. Bessie Coleman fell out her plane, and she fell about 40,000 feet out of the sky, and all of the American people rounded up at the court and decided to give Bessie Coleman a stamp. About 1 year later, her impact on history was she was brave, and she was able to open an all-black flight school even when she was dead.
Did you know that Bessie Coleman was the first African American woman to fly a plane? I'm going to teach you about Bessie Coleman, all her accomplishments, and how she impacted history. Bessie was born in Atlantic, Texas in 1892. 2 years after Betsie's birth, and the family moved to Waxahachie. When Bessie was 9, her dad left her because he wanted to go to another place to get treated better. Also, she had to walk miles to go to a black school. In the hot summer, Bessie had to go to pick cotton instead of going to school. It sometimes took a year or more than a year. Also, Bessie and her family were sharecroppers. She was one of the 13 children. One day, Bessie decided that she wanted to fly a plane, and this is how it happened. When Bessie got out of college, she went to her two brothers. She knew that they had a plane, so when she asked if they could help her fly a plane, and they said yes. Then they were still helping her. She had enough money to buy her own plane. A few months later, she got her very own plane license. Another few months later, a woman named Mia, she was the first woman to go to space, asked her if she wanted to fly in an air show, and Betsy said yes. Then they were looking for a spot for them to land. Betsy leaned out of the plane, and she didn't have her parachute or her seatbelt on. Then the plane suddenly started to spin, and Betsy and Maya both fell out of the plane and died. At the death of Bessie Coleman, they made an all-American black school, plane school.
Did you know that Bessie Coleman went to France for flying lessons? I will be teaching you about Bessie Coleman. She had to walk a mile to school. Her dad left her when she was about 9. She also dropped out of school just to pick cotton. She got enough money to go to college, and she had to move in with her brothers and went to war, and she got a job at a barber shop. When her brothers came back, they said that the girls in French were braver than her. So she proved them wrong by becoming a pilot. She raised enough money to go to Paris for flying lessons. So she went to a school where she learned to fly, and people loved the shoes that she built, that she had. She also liked how she could just feel free. She was invited to special events because she was the first African American woman to get a license. That is very important. I find that very, very important because it's important to history. All because of her, the first woman to get a space, Mae Jemison, was invited. Jemison. That's important too. She was invited to do a parachute, including a parachute stunt, which was included. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt because she had to find a place to jump parachute, and the plane flipped over and she fell out of the plane. And it crashed. I find that very sad because that's just how she died. It was very sad, and she was very young. All because of her dream to have a flight school for African Americans. Now she has that, and she has a day named after her. She also has a coin named after her, and this is her tombstone.
Did you know that Bessie Coleman was the first African American woman to fly? I'm going to tell you about Bessie Coleman's lifestyle, how she grew up, and how she impacted history. Bessie Coleman was born in 1892 in Atlantic, Texas. Her father was an African American. Bessie Coleman hoped to find a good job in Atlantic, Texas. Bessie Coleman had to walk miles and miles to an all-black school. When she was in 7th grade, she dropped out of school. She had to drop out of school because black people had to pick cotton when it's summertime. I think all people should be treated the same because we are the same thing but different skin tone. At the age of 23, she moved to Chicago. It was a painful trip because she was African and African American. She had to sit on hard wooden floors because Bessie Coleman had to get a new job to save money for lessons to learn how to fly in French. Then she was the first black woman to have an air show, and people was inviting her to special places and special events. Then one day Bessie Coleman doing a jump out of a plane, the plane flipped out of the air, and she died. Now in Chicago on May 2nd, they have a day for Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman is one of the best pilot there is. And now her legacy lives on forever. Now they have a school for African Americans only.